So, great. We get the people who aren't seated. We'll be in good shape. So I don't really have to say anything, but I'm going to say something because this is the first time Mike and I have done an event together. I never thought I would be calling him my colleague. He has always been my friend, but I call him my colleague, and I'm so pleased that we are doing this venture together. I do have to say, by the way, because you'll notice on your sheets that David Dreyer was supposed to be on this panel. He's not here. He sent me, and I think he sent Mike too, an email which said, my house burned down in Malibu. It is in total ashes. He said, about the same state as the California Republican Party. So they both have to be rebuilt. So I want to thank Gentry for agreeing to sit in for him, and I want to thank Leslie for being part of this, and I want to turn this over to Mike and say thank you very much for being a colleague.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our panel for joining us. I'd like to thank you all for hanging in. You want to clear a room at USC, just say Republican meeting. How many Republicans we got here, just out of curiosity? Okay, this is going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. Let me introduce our august panel here. Y'all know me. I'm a campaign hack. My old friend Gentry Collins was political director for Mitt Romney in the 2008 primaries. I know him from Iowa politics before that, and he was the political director at the Republican National Committee. He is a fellow here, generously giving his time to be on campus and help steal as many kids from the Dems as we possibly can. These difficult times. My friend Leslie Sherrill here has the best resume of any of us. She is a certified Reagan White House alum. Highest credential you can have in Republican politics. After that, she started slumming for quite a while at ABC News. So she's been both inside the media with the secret Republican Dakota ring and in the Reagan White House and worked on the Reagan 84 re-elect. Mark Short is another patriot who came here to help us out. I'm very grateful to him. He has a gold-plated Republican resume. He was chief of staff to Texas Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. He ran the House Republican Conference for then Congressman Mike Pence. He's supported Marco Rubio in the primary. We disagreed on that one, of course. I was the knucklehead who blew $100 million for Jeb Bush. I now work in the university cafeteria when I'm not doing this, so see, it's good to have a job. And recently he had what I would say is not only one of the most important jobs in the White House, but one of the toughest ones. He was director of legislative affairs in the Trump administration at the beginning, which is the president's person on Capitol Hill, dealing and wheeling and dealing and cajoling and listening to endless demands from the legislative leadership and helped get a lot of legislation that we Republicans are quite happy about passed. So Mark here, and he's worked with President Trump, and I think he'll have particular insights from that experience. And finally, my old friend Steve Schmidt. Schmidt and I lead parallel lives. I worked for Arnold the first time. He worked for Arnold the second time. I worked for McCain the first time. He worked for McCain the second time. He's kind of like the Japanese. He takes everything I do and he improves it. So I'm a big fan of his. He is also a commentator on cable television, as Mark is, as I am. And Steve, and he'll talk more about this, is a vociferous Trump critic like I have been, and he left the Republican Party over it, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. So we're going to do some talking here, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions or insults or comments or whatever you have. And again, our heart goes out to David Dreyer, who loved that house so much and was a victim of the wildfire, though thankfully without any casualties. So in Washington right now, there's a big debate raging in Republican circles. The sky is falling crowd, which is people like me, say the elections were a disaster. We lost the election night TV show because the media is so obsessed with identity politics. They were all about Georgia and Florida and Jesus/Beto running in Texas. And when those all went red on the big scoreboard and the siren went off, the Democrats got very depressed. There were emergency meetings at Rob Reiner's house, and they're high-fiving in the White House. Republicans feeling pretty good. But as the vote came in later, because we have so many mail-in ballots now, it takes a long time, and Florida being Florida, now we're starting to get the real count, and we're looking at the worst congressional losses for the Republicans since the Watergate wipeout of '74. Probably about 38, 39 seats when we're done counting. We picked up 2 in the Senate in a year in a geography where we probably should have done better, at least a couple seats. And we lost I think over 380 state legislative seats. So it's bad, it's terrible, the president drove it, what the hell are we going to do, etc. Now the other argument is, now wait a minute, sky is falling, people. In 2010, 2 years after miracle candidate Barack Obama got elected, Mr. Can Do No Wrong in the media, the Democrats lost 63 House seats. They lost 7 Senate seats, and they lost 600 legislative seats. Far worse than we just went through. So clearly the Democrats were doomed, and Barack Obama could never be reelected after a performance like that. Yet what happened? He was reelected. So we have kind of 2 visions of the state of the party on our side. One, it is horrible wipeout, dim future. The other is this is cyclical. Historically, in the first midterm of a new president, you get clobbered. So I'm going to ask each of you going down, I'll start with Gentry, just briefly to say, which of the 2 analyses do you tilt toward, or do you perhaps have a third analysis that you believe in the most about the short-term future of the party? And we'll get to the long-term stuff later.
Well, my own view is a little bit of both, and I'm sorry to give you a bad answer. Look, I think it is cyclical. I think, as we discussed this morning, that by historical standards, the blue wave was not particularly large. And that I don't view that, though, as a statement that the Republican Party should not be worried. My hypothesis is that both parties are deeply broken, that we've been in a race to the bottom, that the most compelling thing to me is that from 2006 to 2018, every single election, save possibly for 2012, has been a change election, and that each party has won approximately half of those. I think that means the country's pissed off about what we have in Washington, D.C. They're pissed off when we have Democrats. They're pissed off when we have Republicans, and we've been in a race to the bottom. I'm sort of in a third camp, which is that we're angry at Washington, and that the politics of opposition and division are driving that, and the party that can break that cycle first will be a majority party in this country for a long time.
Leslie.
I think it is cyclical for the most part. I think a lot of Republicans probably voted for Democrats this time. So while you may say it's a blue wave, I think the blue wave probably had a fair amount of Republicans in that. So I don't know. I would question whether it was so much of a heavy Democratic voters turning out for Democrats, or whether it was independents and Republicans mixed in there, which gives it more of this feeling of a blue wave. But I think there's a lot of Republicans, myself included, who feel the Republicans really don't deserve to run the whole shooting match because they haven't done such a great job. So I think it's partially that. But of course, in the alternate universe that we're living in, when 43 lost in his midterm, he said we took a thumping. And when Obama lost, he said we took a shellacking. And when Trump lost, he said, what a victory, the American people like me. So, you can slice it however you like it, but I think at the end of the day, I'm not really opposed to a divided government. I think oftentimes it's not so bad. It forces people to compromise. We have oftentimes had full control of all 3 branches and not a whole lot to show for it.
Mark?
Well, first, thank you all for staying until the end of a Friday afternoon. Appreciate the attendance, and appreciate Mike and Bob for inviting us to the university, for hosting us. And I especially, knowing I'm not in the heart of Trump country, appreciate you indulging my perspective here today. I do think we got a lot accomplished over the last couple of years, and we can share that for a little bit later. But let me talk about the way I viewed the election. I probably side more with Gentry on this. I feel that the Democrats had a big victory in the House, and that can't be denied. I think Nancy Pelosi is a historic political figure in our country, and I think she's too often vilified by Republicans. I've had the opportunity to work with her, and I think that she's a very gracious leader for the Democrat Party. And I think the fact that she wasn't just the first female speaker, but waited 8 years to reclaim the mantle, I think shows her persistence, and I think she is a strong leader for the Democrat Party. Having said that, I think you look at some data points to back up the point about Republican night. The average loss in the first midterm is 27 seats. Importantly, over the last 100 years, The average loss when one party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House is 48 seats. So that is a benchmark that I think is an important data point. Republicans have also put in place something called term limits on their chairman, which means in many cases we had 43 Republicans retiring from the House this cycle, which I think is another very difficult thing to overcome, and in many cases caused Republicans to lose seats they may have otherwise been able to hold on to. I think Americans like divided government. I think that is a reality that we face. And so to see the Democrats take control of the House, I don't think is too much of a surprise. In the Senate, I think going from 51 to 53 is a bigger deal than most of the media say. And the reason for that is because if you now are going to have some more gridlock, which I'm not sure we will, I think there's actually a lot of things we can get done across party lines. But if you're going to have less legislation, then a lot of what's happened in the Senate is confirmations. And if you now have 53 senators, it does not mean that every nomination goes through Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. And that is an important way for the president to keep advancing his agenda. So I think that that's a story that actually has been underreported in all of this. So I ultimately say Democrats had a big night in the House. That can't be dismissed. At the same time, there are some elements of this election that benefited Republicans. And so the reality is that even though I admire Nancy Pelosi, I think her being elected Speaker of the House is the best chance for Donald Trump to be reelected as president as well.
Steve?
There's only been 3 elections in the last 118 years where the incumbent president's party has picked up seats in the first midterm. So there was always a significant headwind for Trump, for Republicans, and when you look at it geographically. That being said, we live in a country largely where the politicians pick their voters as opposed to the voters picking their politicians, and thus it has constricted the number of competitive races. So I think that when you look at historic models, they're misleading in that they look at a period of time where there were many more structurally competitive races at a time when the parties were not regionally homogenous as well. Trumpism was on the ballot here, and I think it's delusional to suggest otherwise. And Trumpism was repudiated across vast and large sections of the country, and specifically demographically. So what we saw was the collapse of both the Republican Party and brand in the suburbs of America, and its total expulsion really from urban America and its retrenchment into the Deep South, in the Mountain West, into rural areas. We saw the largest class of women elected in American history up and down the ballot. We saw a generational gap open as how millennials, who are the largest generation in American history, eclipsing the baby boomers. We saw college-educated Republican women defect. We saw enormous gaps with Latino voters, people of color, minorities, anywhere. And so really the parties have defined and stratified is where the Republican Party is doing 2 things. It's shrinking as an institution, while the climate state or independent voters are growing. As the party shrinks like a star, right, as it contracts into a supernova status, it gets hotter, right? So the party is smaller but more intense in service to Trump and his agenda, more populist, more nativist, more Trumpy than before, though it was largely repudiated. Up and down the legislative seats coming into redistricting cycles, this will be enormously advantageous for Democrats. You saw pickups for Democrats of the very important Michigan and Wisconsin governor's races. But overwhelmingly, this was a very sizable victory and a rebuke to Donald Trump. And though what Mark says is true, it is marginally easier to confirm judges in the Senate with more room to give, so to speak. What comes with that trade-off is a Democratic majority that seems very committed to exercise its constitutionally mandated oversight duties and to oversight the executive branch and to have the ability to issue subpoenas. And so the idea, I think, that we're about to enter into a golden age of cooperation at the midpoint of the Trump presidency is dim in my view. But I think that when you look at this, this was a repudiation of Trump. But nobody should confuse that repudiation with it being a indicator that he won't be reelected in the 2020 cycle.
My own quick view is that it does fit the cycles of history, but the Democrats now have a lot more raw political power than they did before in Washington. And the president is particularly, by his nature, vulnerable to having buttons pushed and investigations launched and behavior being pushed, which kind of leads to my second question. I'm a movie guy. One of my favorite political movies, and by the way, we're going to have a film festival series here next year. You're all invited, is The Great McGinty, Preston Sturges picture. It's about machine politics in the 30s. There's a wonderful scene when Alderman McGinty, who was originally a bum who was voting a bunch of times for money for the machine, they make him an alderman. And he comes storming into the political boss's office, and the boss is reading a newspaper, you know, party loses election. And he says, oh, we're getting killed. They're tired of us. They're going for the Reform Party. And the boss, Hakeem Tamaroff, the great actor, looks at him like an idiot and says, yeah, I am the Reform Party. You think I want to starve just because the voters changed their mind? And, of course, they go on to stay in power. Generally, when these bad midterms happen, politicians adjust. Sometimes they adjust a lot. Sometimes they adjust medium, but they adjust. And this is a special question I want to start with Mark. You know the president. My own theory is he's kind of the atomic clock of being Donald Trump, for good or bad. It helps him sometimes, hurts some others. Do you think he will look at the situation and have a strategy to change it up? And you alluded a little bit, maybe try to do some bipartisan stuff, or do you think the president we have is the president we're going to get and he'll just slug it on the way he's been operating for 2 years?
Yes. The way I look at it is I don't think the president's going to change. I think for lots of reasons the president's not going to change. But as far as legislation, I think the reality is you go back to 2008 to 2010 and the years that Obama's agenda was accomplished. It was when he had Democrat control of the House and the Senate that he passed Obamacare, that he passed cap and trade in the House, that he was able to pass the stimulus package. For the Republican agenda in 2016, 17, 18, the reality was that there was Republican control of the House and the Senate. When we started with the first bill to repeal Obamacare, obviously that set the tone. You then move forward into taxes, and I'm disappointed that there was not any Democrat that crossed over and supported the tax reform package. But to be honest with you, there were lots of conversations that I had with moderate Democrats who were not necessarily opposed to legislation, but in conversation, they're like, we're not going to cross the line until you show you can actually govern. You failed on Obamacare repeal, so until you actually show you can do something, there's no incentive for us to come across and actually give you votes. So naturally in the first couple of years, the legislation that you're going to pass is going to be more partisan in that dynamic. There's less incentive to cross party lines. Over the next couple of years, there's several pieces of legislation that frankly, Donald Trump does not fit what I think you would say would be a traditional conservative. So there's several issues he agrees with Democrats on. He agrees with Democrats on an infrastructure package. He agrees with Democrats in what they say that their plan would be, and he actually preferred it over the one his own administration put forward. When we talk about drug pricing, there's issues there that he wants to work with Democrats on drug pricing. Additionally, prison reform. You've seen a lot of attention on that the last couple of days. I'm not confident that's going to get done in lame duck. I think it's unlikely, but I think that will get done in the next Congress. So a question will be, how much do politics intervene and prevent the two sides from coming together? On policy, there's opportunity there. I don't know. I think it's to be determined about the politics. I think Steve raised a good point. If in the midst of this, you're in the midst of subpoenas and potentially impeachment hearings, that's going to create a much stronger headwind to actually get legislation accomplished. But on the policy, Mike, I think there's actually a lot of places where they would agree.
I know pharma's scared for that very reason.
Yeah. Pharma is, and think about the pharmaceutical industry, because in many cases, Republicans are not too keen on it because they felt that they went in bed with the Obama administration to pass Obamacare. And Democrats have never been too keen on the pharmaceutical industry altogether. So, yeah, I think they are concerned about that.
Let me ask, I'll start with Steve and then Gentry, and then I'm going to switch over to a quick media question for you. But, guys, so we've all been around Washington. Let's say, at least in the short term, because I think the one hard thing about doing like an infrastructure or drug pricing deal with Nancy is even if it gets lined up, the president will have a bad day, he'll tweet something, and half her caucus will refuse to be, the external stuff could gum up the deal. But putting all that aside, let's say that some House action starts happening. What do you think the Senate majority does, ideologically? Mitch is, believe it or not, a deficit hawk. Infrastructure is expensive. There are real differences between the D's and R's on how to fund it. Do you think the Senate ideologically would start to take on a deal like that, or do you think they'd roll for it? Steve, we'll start with you.
I just believe there's no chance that any of this stuff will get done in the next 2 years. There's like zero chance, because to me, past is prologue. If you look at, and I just think it's a perfect archetype of Washington being broken, really beyond the influence of Donald Trump. And look at that Judiciary Committee hearing for the Kavanaugh nomination. Chuck Grassley has been up there since 1981. He's 85 years old. And Dianne Feinstein has been up there for 26 years, just reelected, 85 years old. She'll be up there into her early 90s. What that means is the two of them have been working together for 26 years in a body of 100 people. And that was the outcome of the work product. And so the idea that either of these parties are going to suddenly put national interest ahead of parochial interests just leaves me incredulous, having been a witness to recent history on all of it. Lastly, politics has very little to do with persuading people towards an issue. It's about incitement. Right? It's about stoking fear. Right? The campaign did not close on issues and aspirations. It closed on an unprecedentedly racially demagogic campaign launched by Trump, the invention out of whole cloth and broadcast up and down a sophisticated, interconnected series of propaganda networks, de facto, can't call them anything else, that there was an invasion of disease-ridden immigrants about to break through the southern border like a panzer division on the Western Front. And you want to talk about a scandal. The abuse of the United States military, active duty elements of the 101st, 82nd Airborne, or 4th Infantry Division deployed to the border for a political stunt, that defines what's going on in Washington, not the possibility of compromise on any of these issues. And incentives matter. And certainly there's no incentive for any Democrat to be up there and out there, particularly when the presidential race is underway, to say, oh, I've decided to work with Donald Trump on this issue or that issue, because they know that working with him means standing next to him on any given moment of a day when who knows what he's going to tweet.
Not a good photo op.
Yeah, no, I think it's a short window because Democratic primary politics will take over. Gentry, if something quick were done, would the Senate support, or do you think, because remember, Mitch is up in Kentucky, not an un-Trump state, or do you think it's gridlock there? Putting aside the scenario Steve has, which I think is fairly likely that it blows up just because Trump does something that makes him unpalatable to the D's.
Yeah, so it's just accepting the premise that something has gotten through the House, that there's a deal with the president. I actually think that there is some chance that it would then get through the Senate for two reasons. One, I think you've got plenty of Republican members who are afraid of Trump opposition in primary season. And two, I think you've got several Republican senators up for re-election in purple America. You think about Colorado, you think about North Carolina and others. And I think that if the energy both in the nominating base and in a swing state in a general election is let's go get something done, if Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi can agree to it, maybe you bring some Republicans in the Senate along as well. So if you got through the House, I think I'd be more optimistic about getting it through the Senate than maybe my counterpart.
Mike, I know you didn't ask me, but real quickly, just this week, the president had a press conference in which he announced plans for bipartisan criminal justice reform. at that event in the Oval Office were Republicans and Democrats alike, about an even split. So the notion that Democrats won't do a photo op with them, I think, is just this week showing a bipartisan issue that they will be willing to do. Donald Trump will be on the ballot in 2020 in several states that Democrats will be running, including Midwest states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, where they'll want to show that, hey, I don't agree with everything he says or his rhetoric, but I can work with him. And then on the Senate, Republicans have shown consistently they talk a good game about deficit spending, but they've actually shown no willingness to actually stop deficit spending. So to think that they're going to then say that we're going to stand on principle and not support this, and keep in mind, Mitch McConnell's wife is the Secretary of Transportation.
Spoken like a true White House legislative director, where you're playing the inside game. I think I could probably lose a $100 bet with Mark naming 28 favors to Democratic senators that they don't want to read in Carla's column in the Politico. Leslie, Trump's not going to change. Is the media going to change the way they cover him? I work there, and I hear constant carping about him, and then I go out and watch him play him like a fiddle.
No, it is crack cocaine for them.
Yeah.
And if any, we can all blame whoever we'd like to blame for the gentleman currently in the White House for however you feel about him, but he was such a media darling for so long. CNN never been in the black like they are running through that election. They led with him. It reminded me of O.J. Simpson. It was just every day, endless free media. He didn't have to spend a dime. They're still doing it because he delivers. He delivers every day something outrageous and outlandish, and that is what the viewers want. People say they don't want it, but they watch it. The ratings are never been better for news. People love the controversy, which is actually, obviously very sad because you're really just sitting there at a boxing ring. But are you really, talking about serious ideas? Are we really debating what matters? Are we talking about, anything from immigration to health care? And I mean, that's why I got, I was angry. The Republicans have had 7 years. They got it. They were going to reform Obamacare, and they could not do it. So you kind of don't deserve another shot at it until you figure out what you're doing. So I don't think, I'm sorry to say, you look at them on this midterm election night, same thing. And, it's just too good to pass up. And unfortunately, we deliver the ratings to them, and that delivers the money, and therein lies the rub.
Yeah, people forget it's the news business, and they have box office too, and box office speaks louder than anything. Let's play Electoral College Quiz Bowl here as we start to look forward. Now, on election night, the three key states that the president, to his credit, by the way, did what no other Republican candidate for president has been able to do since the 80s, which is carry either Wisconsin, my home state of Michigan, or Pennsylvania. He carried all of them. If Hillary had carried just one of them, she'd be president, but she didn't. That was close. It was about 77,600 votes out of 13.5 million. But in politics, win is winning. So looking at this election night, in Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker, who is essentially the Terminator as far as a political candidate, he is hard to beat, but he was narrowly beat. In Michigan, we got wiped out at every level and lost some congressional seats. And Pennsylvania, we're never really in it. So as a Midwestern harbinger, it's a little scary because that's the lock that he picked before. The other thing that the national media has missed is in Florida, the never dull state of Florida, not only was it close, but forget about it. I think it's going to get closer, but I believe that Scott's going to the Senate and DeSantis is going to be governor. So those were legit Republican wins where the president campaigned. But in some ways, the most important thing for the Electoral College was a thing called Amendment 4, which passed 2-1, which gives felons, of which there are over 1 million in Florida, to right to vote. A Republican friend called me up saying it's not all bad for the president. Excuse me, a Democratic friend called up and said it's not all bad for the president. It means Harry can vote for his dad. But so that's my pandering joke to the crowd. But seriously, that is a huge anvil on the scale in the president's reelect. Yeah. Which means either breaking that equation, which maybe you do. Maybe you make it a radioactive issue in the presidential race in Florida. You can be with the felon candidate or me. Maybe there's a politics there that'll work. But it means those Midwestern states are more important than ever. So I'll start with Mark and then go to Steve. What do you think going forward the White House strategy will be to try to rebuild the Electoral College thing if Florida looks tough?
I'll say that often there's an exaggeration of a White House strategy.
Okay,
Like,
yeah.
I think that the president plays this off of his gut, and I think
Yeah.
he's done that very effectively. I'll share with y'all that, as Mike said in my intro, I joined the campaign because I was Mike Pence's chief of staff on Capitol Hill. So I joined when Mike was selected to be the vice president. And I was a skeptic. I didn't think that we would win that campaign. I frankly had said to Mike, you have a promising career. You'll be reelected as governor. You've got your own pathway. I was a skeptic throughout the campaign, but I can tell you the first night that I called home to my wife, Kristen, on the campaign trail and said, all of us in D.C. and our little beltway are missing something, was Labor Day weekend in Ohio, in a little town in eastern Ohio, when tens of thousands of people turned out from nowhere. And the motorcade could not get through the crowds of people. And I think that we still, in this country, miss out on something that's happened in the middle of our country. We talk about it and saying that both sides are upset. But, you know, frankly, what Neera said on the last panel was true. This president was elected to disrupt the system. And there are so many voters out there who still want it disrupted. And I think that when we sit here and dismiss 63 million people who voted for Donald Trump as racist, all it does is get them angrier and say, I'm pissed off at the media telling me how I think, or commentators telling me what's in my heart. And they continue to come out and support the president. And Ohio is one of the states in this election cycle that actually, Gentry can correct if I'm wrong, but not only kept Republican seats, but actually expanded. In Florida, I thought that we would not do as well as we did. I know Democrats are still voting there apparently, but it looks like Republicans are going to hold on to those seats as well. So I think that the strategy in the Midwest, such there as there will be, is the president is going to be pushing forward a trade agenda. And in many cases, I think that is what was non-traditional for Republicans, but that trade agenda brought in a lot of new people into the party. And the question is, how do we keep them?
Steve, what do you think? If you were, because I know, you know, we're both big Trump critics publicly, but if you were for Trump, where would you go looking for votes? Double down on the industrial Midwest, or, I mean, the cul-de-sac he's put himself into, me, is getting smaller and smaller. If Amendment 4 has an impact on Florida, you still make a run there. Anything change in the recipe? You think we're back to greatest hits again?
Well, I mean, I think he only has three things he can do, right? There's nobody that he can persuade that's already not part of the movement. He's not going to attract, for example, Hispanic voters or African Americans or millennials or, you know, any component of those demographics. So what he can do is he can seek to intensify the base with his issues. A lot of those issues are cultural or the tone or the performance. People really like that. The degree to which victimization has been made a virtue, and he is an avenger culturally. There's a lot to what Mark said about the impact of cultural condescension, right, on big swaths of the country. The reality that the economic collapse in 2008, I think, is the defining event of the generation that we live in politically. The reality that 42% of the country doesn't have $400 cash, that working people haven't seen a real wage increase in 25 years, that there's been people left behind by globalization, that the disproportionate effects of the opioid epidemic are in the regions of the country we're talking about, and the invisibility, right, of people in that part of the country. And the reality is everyone wants to be seen, everyone wants to be heard. And there's a lot to that, right, in the Trump, in Trump country, right, where people are most faithful. But he can incite his base passionately, but his issue growth area is, on the notion that it's a good economy, and the choices between someone like Elizabeth Warren and Trump, where people will say, well, a choice between Trump and the economy seems to be doing well, or someone who's basically flirting with socialism and I think is going to blow up the economy, or the issue where he has some room to grow is on trade. Because the trade message, such as it is in that part of the country, and the fact that he's taken action on it, whether the fights are smart or not. Like that, the soybean market is completely collapsed in Iowa, played a role in the outcome of the Iowa elections. But in other parts of the country, you know, the idea is, well, why can the Germans drop a Mercedes here, but we can't sell a GM over there? That makes a lot of sense to people. And so whether it's the trade war with China or any one of a number of other countries, people like that. And there is an ability for him to connect on that trade issue. You know, that is the fertile ground for Trump, but there's not a lot of other issue areas where he's going to grow, I don't think.
Gentry, if the Mueller report comes back and it says there's a bunch of complicated stuff where Trump's sons knew rich guys in Russia and they were lending money back and forth and doing things that are technically illegal but hard for the average person to understand, and there were some dregs at the third level of Trump's campaign in leisure suits running around taking Russia money and whispering into phones to Roger Stone and everything, and they all get nailed. Does that move the needle in a culturally conservative swing state like your home state of Iowa? Does it meaningfully change things, or does it just fill up the news, make Democrats who hate Trump hate him more, make Republicans who like Trump say, oh, there's the deep state conspiracy again, and the needle doesn't move at all? Or do you think it will significantly move?
I think it doesn't move the needle at all. I think it drives the sort of the boxers into their respective corners, which is a continuation of what I see as what defines our politics right now, which is that I don't love my party so much as I hate the other party. And I would assign that right now to both parties in American politics. I think that what we've just heard here is exactly right. I agree with both of the assessments that were just offered, and I would say they're related to this one. I think the missing piece here about how Donald Trump does is who the Democrats nominate. I think Donald Trump is very beatable in 2020, but I think there are a lot of Democratic candidates, potential nominees, that might hand it right back to this president. I think there is a big part of Donald Trump's base who may be ready for something else, but not ready for anything else, and perfectly willing to put the Trump jersey back on.
Anybody have a different view on the Mueller thing, Mueller, if it's more or less like I'm saying?
I think all the things that have happened have not moved the needle. I mean, how many times have we all said, oh, this is it. This is going to be the thing that's going to have people realize that, you know, we've had enough. It just, I think it will be the deep state argument all the way. And I would just say, as far as you saying the cul-de-sac has shrunk, I think you have to look at Arizona. McSally was in the primary a never Trumper. He comes in and does a rally, she loses. So that to me is even a bigger statement as to whether he actually really can affect these Republican wins in these so-called purple states. And I think Arizona is a perfect example of where that rally, I think, cost her.
This is the thing my Democratic friends never get, because they tend to want a Sorkin movie where the Republicans, somebody gives a speech and they all put on their old uniforms and march up to the White House and arrest the president. And I talked to a lot of these guys. I worked for a bunch of them in the past. And they'll say, Murphy, you know how much fun it would be to go give a press conference and sound like you and call them unfit and scream and yell, because I believe a lot of that actually. You know what happens the next hour? He doesn't change and I'm gone. And I said, what if 10 of you did? And call me when you got the first 4. Because politics is a practical business and the president is still popular within. Well, but I'll still ask the question, because one of the most interesting polling numbers I've seen is, yes, POTUS has that 85% approval, 90 and some, among Republicans. But then you say, well, would you like another Republican to be president or this guy next time? And it drops to about 55. So it's kind of like I'm a Red Sox fan, and our pitcher just killed 3 people, so he's kind of a jerk, but I'm not going to put on a Yankees hat, man. You know, they're worse. So will anybody primary the president, and who do you think they might be? Steve, I'll start with you.
I think the only conceivable person in the Republican Party that would do it is John Kasich.
Yeah. Maybe Flake, too. He's kind of making noises, but no heavyweight with a lot.
No Charlie Baker or any of those guys? Do you think any of those Republican?
He seems to lack a certain decisiveness.
Yeah, it looks like Charge of the Light Brigade to me now, but, you know, maybe time will unwind. I think I agree with Kasich. I think one of the things Kasich's thinking is, hey, I did well in New Hampshire, so I'll go out there, I'll get all the independents, and I'll beat Trump in the primary, and the president will be ashamed like LBJ was, and he'll drop out. Mark, do you think the president's the guy who's shamed out of a primary loss?
I think the president would be fine if John Kasich tried to primary him. I think the reality is that a lot of Trump critics still view it, I think, in a way where it's like an accidental presidency. And they say, he won because Hillary was a bad nominee. And I think what that analysis forgets is I think Donald Trump went through perhaps the most talented Republican field that Republicans have put forward in generations. You look at all the Republican candidates who sat out 2012, didn't want to run against Obama for re-election, waited for their turn in 2016. Senators like Rubio and Cruz and governors like Bush and Walker, a really talented field that he decimated. And so the reality is, if you look at his numbers among Republican voters, his approval rating has been about the same throughout his presidency, but among Republican voters it continues to grow and is perhaps at its peak right now. So I think that any Republican who wishes to challenge him, have at it. I think there's probably a more serious challenge of, frankly, a John Kasich running as an independent, where I don't think he'll actually get many votes. But in some of the swing states, you won't need many to disrupt the turnout, the ultimate election result.
But maybe you can argue Gentry and everybody wants to chime in. It's a little bit like the old Ross Perot thing. So we have a heroic French vanilla ice cream independent. So now you got two anti-Trump candidates splitting the anti-Trump vote. Good for Trump.
Yeah, but Ross Perot gets 19% of the vote and not one electoral college vote, so it doesn't really matter. You can't, if within the winner-take-all scenario, you're dead.
But you could imagine in Kasich's home state of Ohio, for example, that he may draw a big enough number of votes to deny re-election to Donald Trump in a single state. So I do think he has that potential.
And I think, I heard the Democrats panel before us talking about 16 people in their field, and I thought, did you not learn anything from the Republicans? Yeah. You want to say he decimated that field, but in fact he never got 50% of anything. So, he won, but they were all in the 30s. So I think if you end up with one person running against him, you stand a shot at that primary being definitely challenging. So I would say to the Democrats, do not run 16 because you'll end up with somebody who is not actually has the majority of the support. It's a very dangerous road.
So I was listening to the panel earlier, and I could hear.
Can I just jump
Go
on
ahead.
that for a
Yeah,
second?
go ahead.
Because we talk as if again he didn't win more than 30% of the votes. I wonder how many other Republicans on basically our field of candidates would have gotten over 300 electoral votes. So we sit here and talk as if he was a weak candidate. He, in fact, I think, as I said, I entered that as a skeptic. He proved to be a much stronger candidate than I envisioned he would be.
I think, though, if you took a bunch of us who have been in presidential campaigns, winning campaigns, losing campaigns, and you gave both Hillary and Trump's numbers, you injected us all with truth serum and blinded whose numbers they were, we would all say neither of these people could ever be elected president. But what happens is that when two unelectable candidates run against each other, one of the unelectable candidates wins. And this unelectable candidate, in that sense, won by 78,000 votes across 3 states and, narrowly captured the presidency. The result was legitimate. It was not a sweeping mandate. It was against a historically weak candidate. And I'll say this to the Democrats, is that they're going to have to come to terms about something with regard to Bill Clinton's presidency these many years later. And I make no judgment, right? I'm not scolding. I'm observing. And I say this as someone who looks back and says that Bill Clinton, I think, was in the moment a pretty effective president. But what is his enduring legacy? It is only one thing, right? That there was a budget surplus in 2000 is as relevant to today as what the budget surplus was or wasn't in 1828. We have nearly $1 trillion deficits a year now. One thing, half the country, no matter what depravity, what act of corruption, what act of dishonesty, no matter what, says, but Bill Clinton did it. And it's okay. But Bill Clinton did it. And so that dynamic, played an enormously potent role in a unique way in this presidential race. And this is going to be a big Democratic field. There's a lot of interesting candidates in it. You know, if you go out and you say, for example, that we're going to give everybody free education, student loan forgiveness, federal government's going to give everybody a job, free daycare, free health care, right? Explain to me, like I'm a third grader, how that's different than saying we're going to build a wall that Mexico's going to pay for, right? I mean, my personal view is you don't want to be in a dishonesty contest with him any more than you want to be in a foot race with Usain Bolt when it comes to that stuff, right? And so, you know, I think it's a wide open race with a lot of dynamics on it. But I disagree that, you know, Trump would have soared like an eagle, but for unique circumstances in a historically problematic candidate that matched up so perfectly for Trump.
But at the same time, when you began this panel, you said yourself, depending on who the Democrats put forward, Trump could get reelected. So that means, by definition, unelectable seems to be a growing definition. If you said he won before and he can win again.
Well, if we were to put it by that test, unelectable candidate.
Well, that's not unelectable then, if he's won twice.
Well, if you have someone that, but for just the circumstances of that they're in a binary choice election, right, that one of the two is going to win, but that against the mean of what would be traditional candidates, then no. I mean, we've not had a circumstance, you know, ever in the history of the country where you had someone as famous for as long as Hillary Clinton was, 26 years in the center ring of national life, 100% name ID, both of them New Yorkers, both of them as famous could be, with all of the ethical attachments. And we've never tested the proposition, for example, hey, I'm a democratic socialist. I don't think it works in a general election, and I think Trump wins in that circumstance. But his being propelled forward is not on the basis of his popularity. It's not on the basis of his vision. It's not on the basis of how well the country's doing. It's on the basis of how unelectable his Democratic opponent may be.
Well, I see it as there's a similarity, because now that we have a politics of I'm right, you're evil, and each tribe gets together, and anything is fair to do to the other side because they're evil, and all their facts are lies. And so we double down and we get the hardest tip of the spear we can for our side that reflects our primary voters with no flex. So we get Donald Trump culture warrior. And then on the other side, I heard one of the earlier panels, and I can just see how kind of identity politics is incredibly fashionable now in the Democratic primary. And the lesson they're learning from the election is we ought to have more candidates who are much more like our base voters, which is what Trump has done. So that results, at least from my old school get the middle, win a blue state, you know, career, of you have two, as Steve said, kind of unelectable candidates. You have the one that's pure Republican primary that is going to have trouble in purple states. But now you're going to have the perfect California candidate who can't get arrested in a blue state. And it's going to be a battle of party perfection, which is a new model. Because normally somebody needs to try to grab the other formula. Maybe that formula is gone now. And that's why I think the Democratic primary is going to be so interesting. Are they going to do the old pragmatic thing, find a Southern white Protestant? And again, don't write letters. This is not a moral opinion. This is a political analysis. Get a white guy. That's how Democrats have won the presidency for a long time. But the energy is not apparently there. And it's a free country, and we'll see what people decide. But I can see the parallelism between the two primaries, which could make it quite a thing. Now, let's go further into the future. And when President Trump, be it in 3 months, 2 years, 4 years, when he's off the scene, will Trump populism, which is not the classic conservatism that we're all used to, from the Reagan days, from the Republican caucus, the kind of maverick Republican who was still a big fiscal conservative, John McCain, who Steve and I worked for, Mitt Romney, who you worked for, as did I. Is it gone? Will it rotate out, or is it here to stay? That kind of nationalist populism, or don't we know? We got to go litigate it. What's our best guess? Start with you, Gentry, or go all the way down.
I, for good or for ill, view President Trump as a transitional figure and not a transformational figure. I don't think that he describes what the future of Republican or even American politics will look like, largely on the strength of his personality. I think he does and says things that no other Republican could do or say without judgment about whether he's right or wrong. And so I think the future is the great unknown. I think that we need a strong, powerful, ascendant candidate. My own view is that if we had one who could describe why limited government principles actually work to improve the lives of you and your family, your community, your neighbors, that would be a very appealing candidacy, not just to the Republican base, but to the country at large. Will we have that? I think time will tell. I don't have a good answer for you.
Leslie, 8 years from now, are we the party of Reagan, the party of Trump, or something else?
Probably something else. I think the Trump thing will go away eventually. We've always been the party of ideas. We don't talk about it a whole lot anymore. We don't have a lot of ideas. It's all about celebrity and game in the system. I also feel that eventually voters are just going to be simply worn out. They're worn out by the ineffectiveness of government. I think they're also terribly worn out about the party control. Both parties have such a chokehold on this process that the idea of an independent is laughable. We all say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we got more independent, we had more people down the middle of the road. There is no infrastructure. And the Electoral College makes sure that will never happen. And until that winner-take-all, and I'm not opposed to the Electoral College by any means, but I think winner-take-all is the death knell of that process. So I think the minute there is an electric candidate on the Republican side that is talking about fiscal responsibility, personal liberty, the Constitution, is electric, that Trump thing will go. I just think it is gone, and I'm hanging on that.
Bonus factoid, you know who invented the Electoral College? Alexander Hamilton. That's the song that didn't get into the musical. Mark, you've worked at the core of kind of the traditional conservative Republican policy world in the House with the Kochs, and you've been in the Trump White House. What do you think post-Trump ideologically is most likely in the party?
Well, I do think that Trump is a unique candidate at a unique time.
Yeah.
My wife, Kristen, and I, we had the pleasure of actually living in California in our 20s, a long time ago for me. But we were the first directors of the Reagan Ranch when Young America's Foundation purchased it from the Reagan family. And that's sort of the philosophical foundation for me. And if you look at the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, let's put aside the rhetoric for a second. 2 Supreme Court justices that I think would have been very much in line with who Reagan would have put forward. A regulatory agenda that Donald Trump challenged us when he came into office to say, for every new regulation, I want 2 repealed. The rate right now is 12-1. 12 regulations repealed for every new one. Even Ronald Reagan couldn't achieve that. The largest increase in military spending since the Reagan era. The largest corporate tax relief and corporate tax overhaul since the Reagan era. Now, I know I'm speaking to a crowd that is more democratic, and you may not embrace those ideas, but if you look at actually what's been happening, the policy has been very similar. I think the biggest difference is trade. And so I think that's a question that the Republican Party is going to have to wrestle with in the next year or two, because traditionally we are a party of free trade. And I do think that the president brought in a new group of voters who felt left behind by a trade agenda, who saw jobs leave the Midwest. And the question for us is, do we change our position as a party, or do we find a way to educate and bring in new voters? I think that's an outstanding question. But to date, if you look at the actual policy achievements, they've been pretty traditional Republican.
I just have to jump in. It's very hard to put the rhetoric aside. It is very hard. While I agree with many of those policies, I'm certainly a free trader all the way, the rhetoric just screams in my ears so loudly that I can't actually hear the policy.
I understand, and you're not alone in that.
But no, I know, but I think it's bad for the country.
Okay, but for a second, if you're asking where the party is going, to answer Mike's question, I'm telling you where I think you've seen the legislation happen, and the administrative actions, and the nominations.
Well, what's inscribed on Ronald Reagan's gravesite is this quote. It says that, "In my heart, I know that man is good, and that in the end what is right will always eventually triumph, and there is worth and purpose in every human life." That was Reaganism. It is the opposite on the compass dial from Trumpism, which has been demonstrated through his actions, his rhetoric, the vileness, the meanness, the cruelty of it, which I think stains our national honor. And I think we saw that play out with his lack of probity, rectitude, and appalling comportment on this last European trip. Ronald Reagan was a champion of the U.S.-led liberal global order, which he helped lead to bring about the demise of Soviet totalitarianism. He understood the power and the importance of the relationships that bind all of us together in the transatlantic alliance and shared values. So he would not have understood a president picking fights with the President of France, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and would not have understood the autocratic fetish he seems to have for every tin pot dictator that he meets. Ronald Reagan was a defender of America's ideas and ideals, liberalism of the small L variety, of a constitutional republic, of freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of press. Ronald Reagan gave no room to extremists and racists and anti-Semites. Ronald Reagan didn't incite. He didn't wink and nod. He didn't broadcast this stuff with bullhorns. And so the party is shrinking geographically into the Mountain West, into the Deep South. It's becoming a rural, white, ethnocentric blood and soil party. The Republican Party, which was founded in 1854, was founded on the slogan of free soil and free men. It was fidelitous to the idea and the ideal of the country, embedded in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Its first nominee for president was a Californian, John Fremont, in 1856. Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. This was the California Republican Party. California Republican Party is down to 8 seats in Congress. It's smaller than decline of state registrations. And it portends where the National Republican Party winds up. Because if your party is based on old, rural, white people, there's less of them every day. And so demographically, you're in a death box.
I just have to say, too, quick contrast, the wall or amnesty. Trump was for the wall, Reagan passed amnesty.
Yeah,
it
look,
doesn't get any more crystal clear.
No, I understand. I would leave the party in a minute, but I believe it will cycle back, so I'm fighting
Yeah,
from
I
the
do too.
inside because I am ideologically uncomfortable with the Ds. Steve, long-term, quickly, because I've got one last question. We're in the Q&A. Do you think it'll cycle back? Do you think it's gone forever, hence your decision to leave the party?
I think it's gone, but part of the reason it's gone also is that these parties were never ideologically and regionally homogenous, right? We were the Northern and the Western party that could compete anywhere. We can't compete anywhere now, right? The day will come, like in this state, the Republican Party is not a statewide party, right? It has regions of California it can compete in, and the Republican Party ultimately, when you look at the map, right, is moving in that direction as well. It's just expelled from enormous geographies of the country, particularly where there's higher concentrations of population.
So very quickly, then Q&A, putting on a Republican hat, as painful as it is, and assuming the president is running for re-election, who are the two most, theoretically, because we haven't had a primary yet, competitive Democratic candidates from the list of 200? I would say Bloomberg if he can get through a primary, and Mitch Landrieu is a political talent of Bill Clinton level. Gentry?
I'll go with you on Bloomberg and add the easy one, which is Joe Biden. I think he knows how to talk to the industrial Midwest in a way that many of the other Democratic candidates do not.
Yeah, I'd have to go with Joe. And I think Bloomberg's certainly a good businessman. I guess he has to switch parties. He's got to become a Dem.
Well, he's halfway there.
Is it? Yeah, it's halfway there.
Yeah.
Oh, he already made the switch? Okay, so I guess he's running. I mean,
See
why
your
else would
dream
you switch?
candidate there, Divine, from the left side? You think you'd be okay? Go ahead, Mark.
I feel a handicap to try to suggest who the best Democrat nominee is. I think if it's Bloomberg, that's great for Trump. But, you know, I enjoyed the last panel and enjoyed the conversation, but I think it is representative of where the Democrat Party is today, and that the entire conversation was who can take on Trump and why we dislike him so much. And we're sitting here Democrats have just elected new control of the House, and there's no conversation what their agenda is. What is the agenda? It's we hate Trump. And so, you know, that I think is going to fuel their selection of a nominee, and I'm not sure that that's really going to be able to carry the day in 2020.
I would give you a little advice now that you've joined CNN and the disreputable field of TV pundit. Pick somebody who can't win the primary so you can never be proven wrong about the general election.
Thank you.
Steve, what do you think? Who are the two that you'd see theoretically?
I think there's three currents in their primary. There's a left current, there's a new current, and there's a young current. I don't see them nominating someone who's 78 years old. But I think it's someone like a John Hickenlooper out of Colorado. I think a Landrieu is really talented. I would, out of someone in that Senate bracket, I keep an eye on Kristen Gillibrand. But I think it's going to be someone new, someone young.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they're all smart takes. It's Q&A time. So let's start with any Republican primary voter. Yeah, we don't have any. Okay, back there, sir.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so first off, that was amazing. Thank you. Great dialogue. And to get to my question, open question to all, a bit directed towards Mr. Short, but currently I feel, and I think it could be consensus, that there's a narrative in regards to young people that they will always, not always, but they tend to vote Democratic, which is true statistically. It's evident that the young people are the future. That's just a fact. So leading to my question, is there any efforts or considerations by the Republican Party to target young voters more?
You know, it's a good question. I think the Republicans have struggled with young voters for, frankly, decades and still do. I think part of the best thing that we can do, frankly, is to continue to provide good job opportunities and to keep a strong economy. I think that additionally, I do believe, I don't know if this is an issue that actually motivates the younger generation or not, but I do think it has afflicted the younger generation, is the opiate epidemic. And I think that that's one of the things I left off my list that I think is possible for Republicans and Democrats to come together on legislation that addresses that.
And especially just by addressing or highlighting part of the Republican agenda that does benefit the youth could be a very, strategic plan. So, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Anybody else want to address that one?
Yeah, let me offer a thought, which may be a longer-term thought than a shorter-term thought, and I don't know that it's surrounded by a particularly strong strategy centralized in the party headquarters or something. But I am something of an optimist about Republicans' opportunity to pick up even a majority among millennials and younger voters as time goes on. And here's why. I think if you look at what defines millennials outside of politics, who are they culturally? What would old cranky white guys complain about millennials for, right? It's a rejection of conformity demanding things in their lives, right? That these are radical self-government people, right? If I can't click here and get it like that, I'm not real happy about it. If I can't pick my own path in life, if I can't have that kind of control in my own life, I'm pretty unhappy as a millennial. And so I think that eventually they will become politically homeless, and then they will migrate towards an ascendant Republican Party. The Democratic Party that believes Washington can run your life better than you can run it yourself does not fit the millennial generation. And that is why I'm optimistic about the future of the Republican Party.
All I know is when I was in college in the very early 80s, you could go to the college Republican meeting and meet girls. That is no longer the case in 40 out of 50 states. I would suggest we work on that. Next question.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you guys again for a great panel. I wanted to ask generally all of you, talking about the party now being regionally homogenous, and to ask about a couple of interesting office holders up in the Northeast where I'm from, in really blue states like Massachusetts and Maryland and Vermont, with governors like Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan, and Phil Scott. I would argue people who can't obviously win a Republican primary, for president, for example. But do you think that, what do you think that says about, how the Republican Party can make inroads in states that traditionally vote for Democratic candidates? And do you think that they're, exceptions, or do you think that they could become the rule in the future?
They're like white tigers, right? Like very extinct animals, like very, very rare and endangered animals, like on the verge of extinction. There was a vibrant tradition of moderate republicanism that thrived in the Northeast of the country where I was from, right? And it was true that there were a lot of conservatives in the Democratic Party and a lot of liberals in the Republican Party. That's not true. It's ideologically homogenized. Now, in states like Maryland, New Jersey, Massachusetts, the Republican Party has never been a conservative party in those places. It's always been the Reform Party, the good government party. And typically what's happened, in New Jersey would be an example of this, is that you'll have successive Democratic governors who will bankrupt the state, will instigate a series of tax increases that will enrage the voters, and a Republican will be put in there, whether it was Christie Whitman, whether it's Chris Christie, to rebalance the state's books, whether it's Mitt Romney, Bill Weld in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, Hogan in Maryland. They all fit that style of governance, right? It's an opposition party to the machine parties, but doesn't speak to the health of the party. I mean, when LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, there were 3 elected Republicans to federal office south of the Mason-Dixon line. And so you've seen since 1964 this shift geographically where the parties become culturally the Southern Party. And there's been profound implications for that in both the messaging that works and the demographics it attracts and the trajectory of issues that it espouses, particularly on social issues.
It's a great question, because I think there's the narrative that the Republican Party is dead everywhere. And those guys came in a Republican tide in 2014, and it's incredibly impressive that they held on in 2018. I think Steve's right. In many cases, it's in response to Democrat legislatures, and it's a check and balance on them. And those are states that have been poorly mismanaged and gone bankrupt. So we look forward to the same trend coming to California.
I did a lot of those races for Whitman and Mitt Romney in Massachusetts and Arnold out here. And one of the big keys, Steve's totally right about you're the cleanup party, but you're a governor. And when you're a governor, you get to define who you are rather than be pulled into the D.C. food fight. Are you for Mitch McConnell or are you for Chuck Schumer? Where you're forced to pick a side, and your state is a blue state that's picked its side already, and you get the squeeze. Guys like Larry Hogan or Charlie in Massachusetts, they can be what they want to be and zero in on state parties. But it's kind of an interesting irony that in this tough election we just had, our 2 most successful governors were in 2 of our worst states, but they totally been able to sever themselves from any identity of the D.C. Republicans, particularly the president.
But that's a sign of hope.
It is.
It's so interesting to think that people in Massachusetts would have voted for
Oh, yeah.
Baker.
And they love him. And they love Charlie Baker. They love him. Yeah.
Right. Yes, ma'am, right there.
Cycles do change. Years ago, when I came to USC, I was sure that I was an affirmative action candidate, one of 2 Democrats they let in at that point in time.
Congratulations on some success.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say. But the thing I think that worries me most for future elections, and I wonder if I could have your thoughts about it, is how are we going to rebuild confidence in our news media, in our journalism? Where are we supposed to get the information from which to make an intelligent decision?
Well, I'll take that one. First off, people have to stop going to all of these sites that are unreliable. They just keep feeding each other. You have to really seek out. I mean, you know, I'm a Republican who reads the New York Times every day. And say what you want. It is an excellent newspaper. But journalism is really on a long slide down the tubes. And it is because they are feeding this desire from the readers and the viewers for the sensational entertainment news, you know, the Kardashians, whatever it is. We need, as consumers, to raise the bar. You need to bring current events back to school. You need to bring civics back to school. They don't read. Everybody reads a headline, zaps it on their phone, and moves on. So we don't really value good journalism. We just don't. We don't pay for it. We certainly don't want to be ever charged for it. It costs a lot of money to put reporters on a beat. It costs a lot of money to cover Iraq and Iran. It is the security alone will kill you. So just as consumers, we have to decide to raise our bar. And, you know, I don't see that happening. But eventually we're going to get exactly what we want. And I think we're already there. But you got to just support those handful of journalists that are doing good work.
I'll flag one thing, though. I read all the fancy pants because I'm a shameless Republican elitist papers, and I love good journalism. But there has been for decades, I don't think so much a partisan bias as a cultural bias. Because what has happened in the media, just by the way businesses or industries attract people, and I'm going to make an argument by exaggeration here, so it's patently unfair, but I think it'll resonate with the two Republicans here and some of the ones up on stage. Smart kid goes to Brown. Smart kid gets a job in Manhattan in the media business. Smart kid is sent out to Oklahoma to cover something, sees fried food, guns, and American flags and people at a Tea Party rally, reports back, an echo chamber buzzes. And although the New York Times, as an example, is not trying to be a Democratic paper, it has Democratic sensibilities. There is not a full precinct of Republican primary voters working among those 20,000 employees. And so the Republicans smell that cultural distance. And the great tragedy, I think, is that we don't have some of the great old Republican broadsheets like the old Chicago Tribune that balance it out a little bit with real resources. Even the LA Times once upon a time when they were pushing Nixon. That won the room, didn't it? So the point being, don't underestimate the people in those counties in Alabama who, by the way, always over-index on providing troops to get shot at for your liberties, smelling the contempt in some of the national media culturally. And that has created a vacuum where a guy I used to work for named Ailes invented something called Fox News and had a lot of box office and a lot of power. Yes, Carla.
Yeah, can you talk about, this is a great panel, by the way, thanks so much. Can you talk about the effects of two issues on the Republican Party, climate change and how that's going to affect the ability to attract younger voters, which is a really important issue to them, and the issue of the health care, the Affordable Care Act and pre-existing conditions. What's going to happen in 2020 based on that?
After Tuesday, winter is clearly coming. I'll let somebody closer to the climate change policy talk about it. We have a big conference on that coming at the Senate.
I would just say, we're talking about like younger voters, right? You know, as a general proposition, if you're going to them and you're like, I think you should go to jail if you smoke weed, I'm against gay marriage, and I don't think climate change is real, they're not going to listen to you about anything else. Yeah. They've made up their minds about that issue. And so, you know, I think for a lot of younger voters, it's those cultural issues that have imprinted on them a viewpoint about the Republican Party. I think that it's been exacerbated over 2 years, that it's associated as the mean party in their viewpoints. And until the party is able to connect, right, through the cultural prism where these millennials are, you know, I just think it's a really, really hard time. And I think that's where all the climate change stuff plays out. Now, I think it's also a failure of Republicans, right, to you know, you're caught in this debate if you're a Republican arguing with scientists, as opposed to the more fertile ground that says, okay, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I'll accept the science and the experts, but I need to understand the causal connection between the $2 trillion of economic impact associated with your solution, right, for an outcome here that achieves what? Right? How do the two fit together? And so, you know, but no one's listening to you until you break through on some of these other issues.
I also think states are going on their own. You know, they're not waiting any longer. You know, you can't wait for the feds. They're not going to do it. A lot of states have passed all their own, and I think that's, you know, the beauty of the system. If you don't want to wait for the feds, you can pass it on the state level.
I was in a focus group not long ago from Millennial Voter asked to describe the Republican Party, said the town elders in the movie with Kevin Bacon where you're not allowed to dance. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. I would like to thank you all for being here and illuminating some of the principles that we don't often get to hear about, especially in the more liberal bubble of California. But my question is directed mostly towards Mr. Short, but is open to everyone. On the more general sense, I was wondering if you could explain why the Republican Party, or the conservative values in general, consider same-sex marriage a threat to family values, and then on the more direct sense to Mr. Short, how Mike Pence can believe in the philosophy that all Americans are created equal, but then support things like conversion therapy, which is considered by the APA unethical and ineffective, as well as his comment at one point in time, I believe in 2007, that said that the rise of LGBT human rights is indicative of the social decline of our nation.
Sure. A couple things in that question. One, there were reports of Pence supporting conversion therapy that were refuted by the Pence campaign, and I don't think that the journalists who pushed those stories actually had evidence of it. But let's talk about the broader issue of same-sex marriage. I think the reality is, particularly for the younger generation on those social issues, we see more and more people embracing gay marriage. Yet at the same time, different issue, same time more and more young people becoming pro-life. So in the social conservative movement, I think you're seeing life issues winning, and the marriage issue is one that more and more Americans are embracing same-sex marriage. I think for many Christians, there's a perspective that says we can embrace and love all people, but that biblically, marriage is between a man and a woman. And I think that's basically the genesis of Mike's viewpoints, and I think for a lot of conservative Christians.
Yes, sir. I thought I saw a hand there. Luis.
Just a quick question on kind of like what to expect. We heard it in the last panel. What do we expect from the Hill? Is there any legislation? I mean, we're talking about DACA. I mean, we kicked the can long enough. Something's going to happen. We kicked the can long enough with DACA. You know, we know we have to eventually vote on trade agreement, you know, the remake of NAFTA. We know that the moderates from the House have been kicked out now, and you basically have more of the Freedom Caucus managing that. I know Kevin McCarthy is going to have his hands full with that. How do you see something coming out of the Hill that Republicans can feel proud that they moved the country forward?
Well, again, I come at this from a perspective that very proud of what we did the last 2 years legislatively, and I think there were significant legislative achievements to move the country forward. So,
Not tomorrow. I'm talking about tomorrow.
so the next 2 years, I think that really, obviously with divided government, the agenda's being pushed by the Democrats in the House is what they can put forward. I do think that there's several areas that they can work together on, as I've said. The DACA issue is one that I think, frankly, tears both parties apart, and I wish I could tell you that I see a solution there, but I felt like I was in the middle of that battle multiple times, and I think both sides pull their parties back to their bases there. And I think that, you know, despite what I think several on this panel have condemned the president's rhetoric on immigration, the president offered not just legalization for DACA population, not just legalization for DACA population plus parents, not just going back to 2012, but going back to 2008. For a population that we started at 700,000, went to 1.7 million, and offered not just legalization, but a pathway to citizenship. That was something that Barack Obama did not offer. And so when we sit here and say that this is all a Republican problem fault, the reality is the politics of that issue divides the Democrats too. And in the midst of those negotiations, it was clear the Democrats felt they were winning in court on the DACA decisions and felt like, why are we going to give the president a wall that he's asked for in exchange for DACA? And it fell apart. And I don't see that change in the near future.
We have time for one fast question, then I'm wrapping it up. Yes, ma'am, right there.
What do you have to say about Trump condoning violence? At a lot of his rallies, he attacks the press, attacks Democrats. Is that a path forward for Republicans? Are they going to start following him? Because it seemed to be effective, where Trump is still popular, even though he is doing a lot of things that maybe traditional conservatives are frowning about.
I'm for rally violence only against my relatives in Michigan. Other than that,
You got a real thing about
I know
that.
them too well. Anybody want to take that one?
Let me
I
offer.
mean, I condemn it, of course. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. One of the reasons I personally believe he's unfit.
Yes.
I would offer, though, without disagreeing with that, I would offer that one of the things that has to happen in all of American politics is that each party has to call out its own crazies and has to call out the bad behavior on its own side. And I think on both sides in the last couple of years, you've seen a toleration of intolerable behavior. My side calling out the other side, your side calling out my side isn't going to work. We've got to call out our own. And I think that's something that we all share in common. That's not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. That is a problem in American politics right now, and it needs to stop.
I'll just simply offer that I wish the president wouldn't call the media the enemy of the people. I've said that multiple times on TV. I think that a free and fair press is foundational to American democracy. I do think, though, that there is part of the president's rallies that you will recognize is part entertainment and not just a policy speech. And it gets into part of the motions of it. Again, I wish he wouldn't say it, but also critics go to the step and say this president is abolishing the First Amendment. I can't remember a president that's provided more access to the media than this president. To the point that now when he has press conferences, if you look at media Twitter feeds, they're condemning, saying, how much longer is this going to go on? This is ridiculous. It's gone over an hour now. They complain about how long he's giving them access at this point, yet at the same time they turn around and say he's abolishing the First Amendment. So I wish that was not the case. I wish that he wouldn't call them the enemy of people. I don't condone that. But at the same time, I think the rhetoric against the president on this gets a little hyperbolic as well.
I feel like I have to add to this is that the president has lied thousands of times a year. He's the most prolific liar in the history of the country to hold the office. Right? Every day you see an assault on the concept of objective truth. And let's understand what Trump says in plain English. What he says is any story that is critical of me, by definition, is fake news. And if you're in the business of fake news, thus you are an enemy of the people. And when you label people as enemies over and over and over again, you assail and assault fundamental provisions of the American ideal, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, over and over and over again. Well, in this case, what we had a guy living in his white van festooned with images of Donald Trump and targets drawn on the head of Michael Moore and all the other people that are vilified on Fox News. He decided to take action. A sick mind, downrange, decided he would instigate the largest mass assassination plot in American history. We got another guy, who says, my people are being slaughtered, screw the optics, I'm going in. And he went in and he killed 11 Jews at Warschaw.
Who also said he hates Donald Trump.
Who
also said he hates Donald Trump. So let's try to keep this a little bit balanced as when we blame the president for massacres by crazy people.
And he killed them. And he said because the Jews
are too close to Donald Trump. That's what he said. The Jews are too close to Donald Trump, so therefore I'm going for a massacre.
We're funding the caravan. And wherever would he have gotten that idea from? Where, I wonder?
It's totally irresponsible.
Totally irresponsible. And so then Trump says, even after the bombs are sent to CNN, he calls them enemies of the people, and he says that there's violence, that it's the fault of the criticism leveled against him by the fake news. And so I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that he's responsible.
No, not at all.
But
No
he's
one would infer that from what you
responsible.
said.
But he's responsible for a tone that has every ability to trigger action by sick and demented people that are out there.
Okay,
The rallies teem with menace and insinuations and intimations of violence, including weeks ago when he celebrated the congressman who assaulted the reporter. So the intimations towards violence from the primary through today are right to be noticed by you, are right to be condemned, and are completely abnormal in the United States of America by an American president.
I'm going to give Mark a minute if he wants to.
I mean, I said what I said. I feel like the president should not call the media the enemy of the people. But, you know, I think, again, sometimes the reaction becomes hyperbolic in this case. When the president has a son-in-law he's embraced as Jewish, he's raising his grandkids Jewish, he's elevated Jewish members across the highest levels of administrations, and yet we're going to tie him to somebody who massacred Jews who said he was doing it because Donald Trump was too close to Jews. That is quite a circular logic to say a sick person says Donald Trump is too close to Jews, but now I'm going to blame Donald Trump for it.
Okay, on that, as your moderator, I'm going to hog the last word and say the most important word spoken in the world about the President of the United States, and President Trump's words are all too well known to all of us. Thank you, particularly my Republican friends, and Mark in particular for an away game. And thank you for being such good hosts.
About a year from now, when we'll have the second Warschaw Conference on Practical Politics, and I suspect we'll be talking a lot about the 2020 primaries and maybe about what's happened between Congress and the administration in 2019. Thank you all very, very much, and thank you guys. Thank everyone who participated.